The glass in Eleanor's hand trembled, though she told herself it was only the ice settling. No husband yet? Julian's voice cut through the noise of the engagement party like a blade sliding between ribs. He said it loud enough for the small circle of guests near the drinks table to hear, loud enough for her sister Grace to freeze mid-laugh across the room, loud enough for the years to collapse in an instant and drop Eleanor right back into the girl she used to be, the one who believed his promises. She did not flinch. She had promised herself, driving into this town 3 hours ago, that she would not flinch. "I'm doing well, Julian. Thank you for asking," she said, though he had not really asked anything at all. He smiled the way he always did when he thought he had won something, a slow curl of the mouth that used to make her stomach flutter and now only made her skin crawl. He was wearing a suit that fit too well for a man who worked in his father's insurance office, and a watch that caught the light every time he moved his wrist, as if he wanted people to notice it. "I just mean," he said, turning slightly so the small crowd could hear him better. "It's been what, 2 years since we called things off? And here you are, alone, at your sister's engagement party, while she's getting married before you." He shook his head with mock sympathy. "Some things just don't work out the way we plan, do they?" A woman near the punch bowl let out an awkward laugh, quickly covering her mouth when she realized no one else was laughing with her. Grace's fiancé, a kind man named Peter, shifted uncomfortably and looked at Eleanor with something like pity, which stung more than Julian's words ever could. Eleanor felt the old shame rising in her chest, the one that used to live there every single day after Julian had ended their engagement 3 weeks before their wedding, with a text message, no less, claiming he needed space to find himself. She had spent months piecing herself back together after that. She had told herself she never wanted to feel that small again, and yet here she was, feeling exactly that small, in a rented hall with paper lanterns and a string quartet playing too softly to drown out one man's cruelty. "Actually," she said, and something in her tone made the room go quieter, "I'm not alone." Julian raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting her to name some boyfriend he could mock, some ordinary man he could measure himself against and win. "Oh?" he said. "Do tell." Eleanor opened her mouth, then closed it again. The truth sat right there on her tongue, heavier than she expected, more dangerous than she wanted to admit even to herself. If she said it here, in this room, to these people, it would not stay a secret for another hour. And there were reasons, real reasons, why the secret needed to hold a little longer. So instead she said, "It's complicated," and turned to find her sister, leaving Julian standing there, with his half-formed victory turning sour in his mouth. Grace caught her by the elbow near the coat rack, her eyes wide with worry, rather than triumph. "Are you all right? I am so sorry. I didn't think he would actually come. Peter invited half the town before I could stop him." "I'm fine," Eleanor said, and for a moment, she almost believed it. "You didn't have to let him talk to you like that." "I know. So why didn't you say something? Really say something?" Eleanor glanced back toward the drinks table, where Julian was already retelling the exchange to a fresh audience, embellishing it, no doubt, making himself sound wittier, and her sound more pathetic with every retelling. She thought about the phone in her purse, and the message waiting there from a number saved simply as A. Running 15 minutes late, the northern road had a delay. "I hope your evening is going well." She thought about the ring hidden beneath her glove, plain on the outside, but worth more than this entire building and everyone standing in it. She thought about the man who had put it there, a man whose name alone could silence any room in England, a man who had looked at her 3 months ago in a quiet chapel, with an expression she had never once seen on Julian's face, not even in their best days together. "Because it's not the time," Eleanor said quietly, "but it will be, soon." Grace studied her sister's face for a long moment, the way sisters do when they sense something is being kept from them, but cannot quite name what. "You're hiding something," she said. "You've been hiding something for months." "I'll tell you everything," Eleanor promised. "I just need a little more time." She excused herself and stepped outside into the cool evening air, grateful for the quiet after the noise of the hall. The parking lot stretched out before her, lit by a few flickering lamps, the kind of ordinary scene she had grown up with her whole life. It felt strange now, standing in it, knowing what she knew, carrying what she carried. Her phone buzzed again. Not a text this time, but a call. She answered it before the second ring finished. "Hello, Alexander." Eleanor. His voice, even through the phone, carried that particular calm that had first drawn her to him, a stillness that seemed to belong to a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. "You sound tired. It's been a long evening. Tell me." She hesitated, glancing back at the lit windows of the hall, where shadows moved and laughter spilled out into the night. "It's nothing. Just an old ghost making noise at a party." There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that told her he had heard more in her silence than she intended to reveal. "What kind of ghost?" "Julian," she said finally, because there was no point lying to a man who always seemed to know when she was doing it. "He was here. He said some things." "What things?" "It doesn't matter. It matters to me." Something in the quiet certainty of his voice steadied her more than she expected. She had spent so many years learning to carry her own weight alone, to never lean on anyone, because leaning had only ever led to falling. But this man, this strange and formidable man she had married in secret, had a way of making her believe leaning might not be so dangerous after all. "He mocked me for still being single," she admitted, in front of half the town. Another pause, longer this time. When Alexander spoke again, his voice had changed, not louder, but harder somehow, like stone settling into place. "Is he still there?" "Alexander, I am 15 minutes away, Eleanor. Perhaps less, if I don't mind the speed limit. You don't need to come rushing in and making a scene." "I have no intention of making a scene," he said, and she could hear, even through the phone, something that might have been the ghost of a smile. "I intend to simply arrive. What happens after that is entirely up to the people in that room." Eleanor let out a breath that was half laugh, half disbelief. In the short time she had known him, she had learned that Alexander Hale did not bluff, did not exaggerate, and rarely said anything he did not fully intend to do. If he said he was 15 minutes away, then in 15 minutes, her carefully guarded secret would walk through that door, in the shape of a man the entire country recognized on sight. "They don't know," she said. "None of them know. I am aware. This will change everything." "Some things," he said gently, "are meant to change." She stood there in the parking lot a moment longer after the call ended, staring up at a sky just beginning to darken, stars pushing faintly through the fading blue. Somewhere behind her, inside that hall, Julian was likely still enjoying his small, cruel victory, still convinced he understood exactly who she was and what her life had become since he left it. He had no idea. He had absolutely no idea that the quiet, humiliated woman he mocked at a small-town engagement party had, 3 months earlier, stood in a private chapel and become the wife of the most powerful duke in England. He had no idea that the ring she kept hidden beneath her glove was one that women across the country would trade almost anything to wear. He had no idea that in a matter of minutes, the same room that had watched her shrink under his words would watch her stand taller than any of them could have imagined. Eleanor smoothed the front of her dress, took one steadying breath, and walked back toward the hall, her heart pounding, not with the old fear Julian used to plant there, but with something new. Anticipation, perhaps, or maybe simply the quiet, growing certainty that her life no longer bent to the opinions of people who had never truly known her at all. Inside, the party carried on exactly as it had before she left, small and warm and unaware. Grace caught her eye from across the room and gave her a questioning look, silently asking if she was truly all right. Eleanor answered with a small, private smile, the kind that promised answers were coming, even if she could not yet explain why. Julian noticed her return and could not resist one final jab, raising his glass slightly in her direction. "Glad you didn't run off crying," he said, just loud enough for those nearby to hear, drawing a few uncomfortable chuckles. Eleanor met his eyes without flinching this time. "I wasn't crying," she said simply. "I was on the phone with my husband." The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward in silence. Julian's smile faltered, his glass pausing halfway to his lips. "Your husband," he repeated, as though the word itself might be a trick. "Yes," Eleanor said, and for the first time all evening, she felt entirely, calmly herself. "You'll meet him shortly." Somewhere outside, gravel crunched under the weight of an approaching car, its headlights sweeping briefly across the windows of the hall before going dark. Eleanor did not need to look to know who had arrived. She simply stood a little straighter and waited for the door to open, and for the life she had kept quietly hidden to finally, unmistakably, begin. The door opened, and the noise of the party did not stop all at once, but rather seemed to fold in on itself, conversations trailing off one by one as heads turned toward the entrance. A man stepped through, tall and composed, wearing a dark coat that had clearly never been bought off any rack in this town. He did not rush. He did not look around for approval or attention. He simply walked in, as though the room existed to receive him, which, in a way, it did. Grace was the first to recognize him, though only from photographs she had seen years ago in magazines her mother used to keep on the coffee table. Her mouth opened slightly, no sound coming out, her eyes darting between the man at the door and her sister standing near the center of the room. "That's," she started, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Alexander Hale," Eleanor said quietly, though every person near her heard it clearly. "My husband." The name moved through the crowd like wind through tall grass, whispered from one guest to the next, growing louder as more people understood exactly who now stood among them. The Duke of Ashworth was not simply a wealthy man. He was one of the last true aristocratic powers left in England, a man whose family had shaped policy and industry for generations, whose name appeared in headlines whenever he so much as changed the direction of his business interests. He rarely appeared in public. He almost never appeared unannounced. And yet here he was, in a rented hall in a small town, walking directly toward Eleanor, with an expression that held no trace of the coldness people whispered he was famous for. "I apologize for the delay," he said to her, his voice low, meant only for her, though the whole room strained to hear it. "The roads were worse than I expected." "You didn't have to come at all," Eleanor said, though the warmth in her voice betrayed how glad she was that he had. "I believe I did," he said, and then, without breaking eye contact with her, he added, loud enough now for the room to hear, "I understood. There was some confusion here about your marital status." A ripple of nervous laughter passed through some of the guests, though no one dared look directly at Julian, who stood frozen near the drinks table, his glass still in hand, his earlier smugness draining visibly from his face. "Julian," Eleanor said, turning slightly so both men were in view. "This is my husband. Alexander, this is Julian. We used to know each other." Alexander's gaze moved to Julian with the calm, assessing patience of a man who had spent his entire life learning to read people quickly and accurately. Whatever he saw there did not seem to impress him. "Ah," Alexander said simply. "The gentleman, with the memorable timing." Julian attempted a smile, though it came out strained and uneven. "I didn't realize Eleanor had." He paused, searching for words that would not make him sound as foolish as he clearly felt. "Remarried. Congratulations, of course." "She has not remarried," Alexander said. "She is married. There was no previous marriage to precede it." The correction was gentle in tone, but precise in effect, and Eleanor had to bite back a smile at how effortlessly he had managed to remind everyone present exactly what kind of engagement Julian had actually offered her, and how little it had ultimately meant. Grace finally found her voice and crossed the room quickly, pulling Eleanor a little away from the men. "You married a duke," she whispered fiercely, somewhere between delight and disbelief. "You married an actual duke, and you didn't tell me?" "I wanted to," Eleanor said. "There were reasons I couldn't. I promise I'll explain everything." "You'd better," Grace said, though her eyes were shining now, not with anger, but with something closer to joy. "This is the best thing that has ever happened at one of my parties." Across the room, Peter approached Alexander with the careful politeness of a man unsure exactly how one greets a duke at an engagement party, eventually settling on a firm handshake and a slightly too formal, "Welcome, sir. We're honored to have you." "The honor is mine," Alexander replied smoothly. "Grace speaks fondly of you. Eleanor mentions the two of you often." Peter blinked, clearly startled that a duke knew his name at all, let alone anything about him. "She does?" "She does." The tension that had gripped the room since Alexander's arrival began, slowly, to loosen. Guests who had been whispering behind, raised hands, started to relax, drawn instead into a kind of fascinated curiosity, eager now to witness rather than judge. Only Julian remained rigid near the drinks table, his earlier audience having quietly drifted away from him towards safer, more interesting company. He waited until Alexander stepped away to speak briefly with Peter and Grace before approaching Eleanor again, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier mockery. "You could have told me," he said. "Told you what exactly?" Eleanor asked. "That my life moved on after you ended it with a text message? I didn't think I owed you an explanation for anything, Julian. Not then, and certainly not now. I didn't mean for it to come out the way it did earlier," he said, and for a moment, something almost like genuine embarrassment flickered across his face. I saw you standing there and I thought, you thought I would still be exactly where you left me," Eleanor finished for him. "Small, alone, easy to mock. I understand. It must be difficult to realize that isn't true." Julian had no answer for that. He glanced once toward Alexander, taking in the quiet, effortless authority the man carried simply by existing in a room, and something in his expression settled into resignation. "He seems," Julian started, then paused, choosing his next word carefully. "Serious. About you, I mean." "He is," Eleanor said simply. "And you're happy?" She thought about the question longer than she expected to, not because the answer was uncertain, but because she wanted to give it the honesty it deserved. She thought about the quiet mornings at Ashworth Manor, the careful, patient way Alexander had earned her trust rather than demanded it, the way he listened to her, the way no one ever had before, as though her thoughts genuinely mattered to him. "Yes," she said finally, "I am." Julian nodded slowly, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked genuinely humbled rather than performing humility for an audience. "Then I suppose I owe you an apology. For earlier, and probably for a lot more than that." "You do," Eleanor agreed. "But I'm not sure this is the moment for it." Across the room, Alexander's eyes found hers again, steady and warm, and something passed between them that needed no words at all. Eleanor excused herself from Julian without waiting for his response, and crossed the room toward her husband, feeling for the first time all evening entirely, unmistakably herself. "You didn't need to reveal everything tonight," she said quietly as she reached him. "We could have waited." "Perhaps," Alexander said. "But I find I have very little patience left for watching people underestimate you, Eleanor. Especially people who once had the privilege of knowing you, and threw it away." She studied his face, the sharp lines of it softened now by something she still was not entirely used to seeing directed at her, something that looked remarkably like devotion. "You came all this way just to correct one rude comment." "I came because you needed me," he said simply. The correction of rude comments was merely a pleasant secondary benefit. Behind them, the party slowly resumed its normal rhythm, though the conversations now carried a distinctly different energy, charged with the thrill of having witnessed something extraordinary unfold in the middle of an ordinary evening. Grace watched her sister and the Duke from across the room with an expression of pure delight, already imagining the questions she intended to ask the moment they were alone. But even as the evening settled back into celebration, a quiet unease lingered beneath the surface for Eleanor, a small, persistent thought she could not quite silence. Their marriage had been kept secret for good reason, reasons that involved far more than simply avoiding gossip. Somewhere beyond this small town, beyond this rented hall with its paper lanterns and string quartet, a man named Reginald Hale had been waiting patiently for exactly the kind of opportunity that tonight's revelation might now hand to him. Eleanor did not yet know how quickly word would travel, or how far, or into whose hands it might eventually land. She only knew, standing there beside Alexander with the whole room finally aware of the truth, that whatever difficulties lay ahead, she no longer intended to face them without him standing directly beside her. The blueprint tore straight down the middle the moment Eleanor set it on the long oak table, and she barely managed to stop herself from swearing out loud in front of the man who owned the estate she was standing in. "That," said a low voice from the doorway, "was an original drawing from 1852. Eleanor's head snapped up. Alexander Hale stood in the doorway of the East Wing Library, arms crossed, his expression unreadable in the dim afternoon light, filtering through tall windows in need of repair. She had been warned about him before accepting this contract, warned that the Duke of Ashworth was difficult, distant, and unforgiving of mistakes. She had not expected to prove the warning true within her first 10 minutes on the property. "I'm terribly sorry," she said, quickly gathering the torn pieces. The paper was already fragile. It must have been damaged before I even touched it. I can have it professionally restored. I know someone in London who specializes in— It was already damaged, Alexander said, cutting through her rambling apology. I am aware. I simply wanted to see how you would respond to being blamed for something that was not your fault. Eleanor blinked at him, caught somewhere between confusion and irritation. That seems like an unusual way to greet the person you hired to restore your family's estate. I did not hire you, he corrected. My estate manager hired you. I am still deciding whether that decision was a sound one. Then let me help you decide, Eleanor said, straightening her spine and meeting his gaze directly, refusing to let his tone intimidate her the way she suspected he expected it to. I have restored 3 historic properties in the past 4 years, each on time and within budget, each preserving original architectural details that other firms wanted to simply replace with modern materials. I did not come here to be tested with torn paper, Your Grace. I came here to save this wing of your house before it collapses in on itself, which, if you'll allow me to say so, it is dangerously close to doing. For a long moment, Alexander said nothing at all, simply studying her the way one might study an unfamiliar species of bird that had unexpectedly landed on a windowsill. Then, to her surprise, something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but an easing of the tension that had been there before. You're not what I expected, he said. I get that a lot, Eleanor replied. Usually right before people underestimate me anyway. I have no intention of underestimating you, Alexander said. I simply wished to see whether you would fold under pressure or stand your ground. This house has survived worse than a torn drawing. It requires someone capable of the same resilience to restore it properly. And did I pass your test? You did, he said, though I would advise against tearing any more of my family's history in the process. Over the following weeks, Eleanor threw herself into the work with the same intensity she brought to every project, mapping every crack in the foundation, every water-damaged beam, every piece of original craftsmanship worth preserving beneath decades of neglect. She rarely crossed paths with Alexander during the day, as he kept largely to his private study on the far side of the house, emerging only occasionally to review her progress with the same careful, assessing gaze he had used on their first meeting. It was the evenings that changed things. Quiet, unplanned moments, neither of them expected. She found him one night standing alone in the half-restored library, staring up at a section of ceiling she had spent the day painstakingly repairing, a section that revealed, beneath years of grime, an intricate painted mural of a garden that had been hidden from view for nearly a century. My grandmother used to tell me stories about this room, he said quietly, not turning to look at her as she entered. She said her own grandmother had commissioned that mural, though by the time I was born, it had already been painted over. I always assumed the story was exaggerated. It wasn't, Eleanor said, coming to stand beside him, careful to keep a respectful distance. There's actual garden layout in the mural, the same one that used to exist, just outside these windows, based on the old property records I found in the archive room. Someone loved this house very much, once. They did, Alexander agreed, and for a moment, something in his voice carried a weight far heavier than simple architectural interest, something that spoke of loss and inherited responsibility, and the quiet loneliness of carrying an entire family legacy on one's shoulders. It has become difficult, these past years, to remember that this house was ever meant to hold joy rather than simply obligation. Eleanor glanced at him, surprised by the sudden honesty, wondering what exactly had happened to make a man as guarded as Alexander Hale let his walls down, even briefly, in front of someone he barely knew. May I ask what changed? She said carefully. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. My father passed 3 years ago. My mother, the year before that. My younger brother chose to walk away from the family entirely, rather than share in its burdens. And my cousin Reginald has made it clear he believes himself far more suited to managing this estate than I am. I inherited a house full of history, and a family full of absence, Miss Whitmore. It has been difficult, these past years, to see much reason for hope in either.
I'm sorry, Eleanor said quietly. That sounds incredibly lonely.
It is, Alexander admitted, surprising himself as much as her, with the honesty of the confession. Though I confess, it has felt slightly less so these past weeks, watching you bring life back into rooms I had assumed were beyond saving. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at the unexpected warmth in his words, quickly reminding herself that she was here to do a job, nothing more, and that entertaining any deeper feelings toward a man of his position would be, at best, foolish, and at worst, genuinely dangerous to her professional reputation. "I'm simply doing my work, Your Grace," she said. "Alexander," he corrected gently. "If we are to spend the coming months working together, I would prefer you use my name." "Alexander," she repeated, testing the sound of it, surprised by how naturally it settled between them. Their evenings together grew more frequent after that, not by any explicit arrangement, but simply through the quiet gravity of two people, drawn increasingly toward each other's company. He began seeking her out deliberately, asking her opinion on decisions well beyond the scope of her original contract, listening to her thoughts with a genuine curiosity that made her feel, for the first time in years, truly seen, rather than simply tolerated. She learned, slowly, the man beneath the title. She learned that his coldness was less arrogance and more armor, built carefully over years of watching people approach him only for what his position could offer them. She learned that he read late into the night, that he preferred quiet mornings to grand breakfasts, that he carried the weight of every tenant on his estate, as though their well-being were a personal responsibility, rather than simply a business obligation. And he, in turn, learned her. He learned that she had built her career from nothing, after her father's small architecture firm collapsed under debt she had spent years quietly helping to repay. He learned that she preferred honesty, even when it cost her opportunities. That she measured her own worth, not by other people's opinions, but by the integrity of her work. That beneath her confident exterior lived someone who had been hurt badly enough, once, to guard her heart as fiercely as he guarded his family's legacy. It was on a cold evening in late autumn, months into the restoration project, that Reginald Hale first arrived at Ashworth Manor unannounced, and Eleanor's quiet, careful world began, without warning, to shift into something far more complicated and far more dangerous than she had ever anticipated. "You cannot possibly believe the board will continue to support you," Reginald said, his voice echoing through the grand hall, as though he already owned it, "when you cannot even manage to secure your own bloodline." Alexander stood perfectly still at the base of the staircase, his jaw tight, his hands clasped behind his back, in the controlled posture Eleanor had come to recognize as the outward sign of a temper being held carefully in check. She stood a short distance away, having been summoned from the east wing the moment Reginald's car appeared in the drive, uncertain why her presence had been requested at all. "My marital status has nothing to do with the board's decisions regarding estate management," Alexander said evenly. "On the contrary," Reginald replied, a thin smile playing across his lips. "Your grandfather's trust explicitly states that full control of the estate, and the family's controlling shares in the Ashworth holdings, transfer to the next eligible heir, should the current duke fail to marry within 5 years of assuming the title. You are 3 months from that deadline, cousin. 3 months, and as far as I am aware, you have not so much as courted anyone seriously in the past 2 years. Eleanor watched Alexander's expression carefully, searching for panic or desperation, finding instead only the same controlled calm he wore for everything. But beneath that calm, she could see something else now, something she recognized, because she had felt it herself once. The particular exhaustion of a person who had spent years fighting battles alone. "The trust also states," Alexander said, "that the marriage in question need only be legally binding, not born of any particular romantic history. I am well aware of the terms of my own inheritance, Reginald. You needn't recite them to me as though I have somehow forgotten the conditions of my own life." "Then perhaps you can explain," Reginald said, "why you have made no visible effort to satisfy those conditions, when the consequence of failure means losing everything our family has built over the past 4 generations, not merely to some outside party, but to me. Because marriage is not a business transaction, to be rushed simply to satisfy your ambitions," Alexander said, his voice sharpening slightly for the first time. "It is precisely a business transaction," Reginald snapped. "That is exactly what the trust was designed to acknowledge. Marry Alexander, or step aside and allow someone with actual foresight to manage what our family has spent centuries building." He left as abruptly as he had arrived, the heavy front door slamming shut behind him, with enough force to rattle the windows of the entrance hall. Alexander remained standing at the base of the staircase for a long moment afterward, his shoulders carrying a weight Eleanor had never seen him display so openly before. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, unsure what else there was to say. "I didn't realize the situation was this serious." "It has been serious for some time," Alexander admitted. "I simply preferred not to burden you with it." "You could have told me." "Told you what exactly?" he said, turning to face her fully now. "That I am facing the loss of everything my family has built, not because of any failure of management, but because I have not managed to convince some willing woman to marry me within an arbitrary deadline set by a grandfather who died before I was even born." Eleanor studied him carefully, an idea forming in her mind that felt equal parts reckless and strangely inevitable. "What exactly does the trust require? Legally, I mean." "A legal, binding marriage," Alexander said. "Nothing more specific than that. No requirement of duration, no requirement of romantic history, simply a legitimate union recognized under law." "Then marry me," Eleanor said. The words left her mouth before she had fully considered them, and yet the moment they hung in the air between them, she found she did not want to take them back. Alexander stared at her, clearly startled by the suggestion. "Eleanor, I cannot ask that of you. It would mean binding your life to mine, under circumstances that offer you nothing but complication and public scrutiny." "You didn't ask," she pointed out. "I offered. And it wouldn't offer me nothing, Alexander. My family has struggled financially since my father's firm collapsed. A legitimate marriage arrangement, structured properly, could ensure my mother never has to worry about her medical bills again, could allow me to finally finish paying off debts that have followed me for years. This could benefit both of us, not simply you." "You would be entering a marriage with no promise of affection," Alexander said carefully, as though testing whether she truly understood what she was proposing. "I understand exactly what I would be entering," Eleanor said. "A practical arrangement between two people who happen to respect each other, structured to solve two very real problems at once. I'm not asking for romance, Alexander. I'm offering a solution." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with the same careful, assessing gaze he had used on the day they first met, though this time, something warmer moved beneath the surface of his consideration. "If we do this," he said finally, "it must remain private, at least initially. Reginald cannot be allowed to investigate the circumstances closely enough to challenge its legitimacy, and I would prefer to protect you from the scrutiny that would inevitably follow any public announcement before we are both prepared for it." "I can live with privacy," Eleanor said. "And you understand," he continued, "that once this begins, there will be no simple undoing it. The trust requires the marriage remain legitimate and ongoing, not merely a brief technicality to satisfy a deadline before quietly dissolving afterward." "I understand," Eleanor said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the weight of that permanence did not frighten her the way she expected it to. They were married 3 weeks later, in a small private chapel on the far edge of the estate grounds, witnessed only by Alexander's estate manager and an elderly clergyman who had served the family for decades and could be trusted absolutely with the secret. Eleanor wore a simple dress rather than any elaborate gown, and Alexander wore an ordinary dark suit rather than any ceremonial finery, both of them treating the occasion with the quiet practicality they had agreed upon. And yet, standing across from him in that small stone chapel, watching the late afternoon light fall through narrow windows onto his face as he spoke his vows with unexpected solemnity, Eleanor felt something stir in her chest that had nothing at all to do with practicality, and everything to do with the growing, undeniable realization that she had begun to care for this man far more deeply than either of them had originally intended. She did not yet know whether he felt anything similar in return. She only knew, as he slid a plain gold ring onto her finger and looked at her with an expression far too tender for a man supposedly entering a simple business arrangement, that whatever this marriage had been designed to be, it was already becoming something else entirely. The teacup shattered against the stone floor the moment Eleanor heard Alexander's raised voice coming from his study, something she had never once heard in the 2 months since their wedding. She rushed toward the sound before she could think better of it, pushing the heavy door open to find him standing behind his desk, phone pressed to his ear, his free hand braced against the wood, as though he needed the support to remain standing. "I understand the numbers," he was saying, his voice tight with a frustration she had never witnessed him display. "I am simply asking you to explain how 3 separate investments collapsed within the same financial quarter. without anyone raising a single concern beforehand. Eleanor lingered in the doorway, uncertain whether to leave him to his call or stay, in case he needed something. He glanced up and caught her eye, and something in his expression shifted, softening slightly despite the tension still gripping his shoulders. He gestured for her to stay. The call ended a few minutes later, and Alexander set the phone down with more force than necessary, exhaling slowly as he sank into the chair behind his desk. "Bad news?" Eleanor asked carefully, stepping into the room now that the conversation had ended. "Reginald's doing, most likely," Alexander said. 3 of the estate's smaller investments failed unexpectedly this quarter, all within businesses he has previously expressed interest in acquiring for himself. I cannot prove anything yet, but the timing feels far too convenient to be coincidence. "Do you think he's trying to weaken the estate's finances deliberately?" "I think," Alexander said, rubbing his temple, "that my cousin has spent years believing he deserves this position more than I do, and he has never been particularly patient about waiting for opportunities to prove it." Eleanor crossed the room and settled into the chair across from his desk, the gesture familiar now after weeks of similar evenings spent discussing the estate's various challenges together. What had once been a formal, business-like arrangement had, somewhere along the way, become something far more comfortable, something that felt less like duty and more like genuine partnership. "What can I do to help?" she asked. Alexander looked up at her, something in his expression softening further at the simple, unguarded sincerity of the question. "You already do more than you realize, simply by asking." "That's not an answer." "No," he admitted, allowing himself a small, tired smile. "It isn't, but it happens to be true nonetheless." Over the following weeks, their evenings together deepened into something neither of them had quite anticipated when they first agreed to their practical arrangement. Alexander began seeking her opinion not just on estate matters, but on decisions that had nothing at all to do with duty or obligation, asking what she thought of a particular painting he was considering purchasing, or whether she preferred the gardens redesigned in the formal style his grandmother once favored, or something wilder and more natural. Eleanor found herself, in turn, sharing pieces of herself she had not intended to reveal, stories about her father's slow decline into debt and despair before his death, about the quiet ache of watching her mother struggle to maintain dignity through financial hardship, about the fear that had followed her ever since Julian's abrupt abandonment, the fear that she was somehow fundamentally difficult to love. "That is an absurd fear," Alexander said one evening, when she finally admitted it to him over a quiet dinner, in the smaller family dining room they had begun to prefer over the grand formal one. "You are, without question, one of the most capable and genuinely good people I have ever known." "You're required to say that," Eleanor teased. "I'm your wife, after all." "I am required to do many things as your husband," Alexander said. "Complimenting your character honestly is not one of them. I say it because it happens to be true, Eleanor, not out of obligation." She felt heat rise in her cheeks, an increasingly familiar sensation whenever he spoke to her with that particular quiet sincerity. "You're very good at saying exactly the right thing, you know." "I am considerably less skilled at it than you might think," Alexander admitted. "I have simply never before had someone in my life worth practicing the skill for." The words settled between them with a weight that neither acknowledged directly, though Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest all the same, a quiet, dangerous warmth that she recognized, with growing unease, as the early stirrings of genuine affection. It became harder, as the weeks passed, to remember the careful boundaries they had originally established. She found herself waiting eagerly for their evening conversations, found herself smiling at small text messages he sent during the day, simply to share some passing thought, found herself, on more than one occasion, catching him watching her with an expression that looked remarkably like tenderness, before he quickly composed himself back into his usual careful reserve. One evening, walking together through the newly restored library beneath the mural she had uncovered months earlier, Alexander stopped suddenly and turned to face her, something uncertain flickering across his usually composed features. "Eleanor," he said, "I find myself in an unusual position." "What position is that?" "I agreed to this marriage, believing it would remain purely practical," he said carefully. "A solution to a legal obligation, nothing more. And yet I find, increasingly, that my feelings toward you have grown into something considerably more complicated than practicality would suggest. Eleanor's heart quickened, though she forced herself to remain outwardly calm. I think of you constantly, Alexander admitted, his voice lower now, more vulnerable than she had ever heard it. I look forward to our evenings together, more than I have looked forward to anything in years. I find myself wanting to protect you, not out of duty, but because the thought of anything causing you pain is genuinely unbearable to me. I believe, Eleanor, that I have fallen in love with my own wife, despite every intention to avoid exactly that outcome. Eleanor stood very still, the confession settling over her like warm sunlight breaking through clouds she had not realized were there. I was afraid to say it first, she admitted quietly. I felt the same way for weeks now. I told myself it was foolish, that I was only imagining feelings that weren't really there. They are there, Alexander said, closing the distance between them. I promise you, they are entirely, unmistakably there. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, feeling the warmth of his fingers closing gently around hers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply standing together beneath the painted garden mural. Two people who had entered a practical arrangement and found, instead, something neither had dared to hope for. But even as Eleanor allowed herself to fully embrace the joy of the moment, a small, persistent worry lingered at the edges of her happiness. Reginald had not stopped his investigations simply because Alexander had married. If anything, his suspicions about the sudden, convenient timing of the union had only grown sharper in recent weeks, and Eleanor knew, with a certainty that settled uncomfortably in her stomach, that a man as determined as Reginald would not rest until he found some way to challenge what he clearly believed was an arrangement built on far shakier ground than genuine devotion. She did not yet know how right that fear would prove to be, or how quickly the quiet happiness she had finally allowed herself to feel would be tested by forces neither she nor Alexander could fully control. The private investigator's report landed on Reginald's desk on a wet Tuesday morning, and by the time he finished reading the final page, a slow, satisfied smile had spread across his face. Interesting, he murmured to himself, tapping the folder against his palm before setting it down and reaching for his phone. Very interesting indeed. The report detailed everything he had spent the past 2 months quietly gathering, every fact about Eleanor Whitmore's background, assembled with the precision of a man who left nothing to chance. Her father's failed architecture firm, the debts she had spent years quietly repaying, the timing of her contract at Ashworth Manor, beginning mere months before Alexander's sudden, unannounced marriage. It was not proof of anything illegal, not yet, but it was more than enough to build a compelling case that the marriage had been arranged with suspicious convenience, precisely timed to satisfy the trust's deadline, rather than born of any genuine romantic connection. He dialed a number he had used only twice before, a lawyer known for his willingness to explore legal gray areas that more reputable firms preferred to avoid. I need you to review something for me, Reginald said when the call connected. A marriage. I have reason to believe it may not meet the legitimacy requirements outlined in a particular family trust. Send the details, the lawyer replied. I'll need documentation of the timeline, any financial records connecting the parties beforehand, and ideally, something demonstrating the marriage lacks the genuine characteristics the trust likely intended to require. I can provide all of that, Reginald said, satisfaction creeping into his voice, given enough time and enough pressure applied in the right places. Meanwhile, at Ashworth Manor, Eleanor remained blissfully unaware of the storm quietly gathering against her, too occupied with the genuine happiness she had finally allowed herself to embrace fully, alongside Alexander. Their days had settled into a rhythm neither of them had anticipated when they first entered their practical arrangement, filled now with quiet affection rather than careful distance, with shared laughter over morning coffee rather than polite, guarded conversation. It was Alexander's estate manager, a steady, observant man named Edmund who had served the family for over 20 years, who first brought word of Reginald's activities to Alexander's attention. He's been asking questions, Edmund said one afternoon, finding Alexander alone in his study. Discreetly, but persistently, about Mrs. Hale's background, primarily, about the timeline of your marriage relative to her contract here. Alexander's expression darkened immediately. How do you know this? One of the staff mentioned a man matching Reginald's description of a private investigator, Visited the village last month, asking around about Miss Whitmore, as she was known before your marriage. Word travels quickly in small communities, Your Grace. He's building a case, Alexander said grimly, more to himself than to Edmund. He intends to challenge the marriage's legitimacy under the trust's terms. Is there cause for genuine concern? Edmund asked carefully. Legally speaking, I mean. Alexander considered the question for a long moment. The trust required a legitimate marriage, and legally, his union with Eleanor was unquestionably legitimate, properly documented and witnessed by a clergyman with decades of unimpeachable service to the family. But Reginald did not need to prove illegitimacy in any legal sense to cause damage. He simply needed to create enough doubt, enough public suspicion, to force a lengthy legal battle that could drain the estate's resources and reputation, regardless of its eventual outcome. There is cause for concern, Alexander admitted, not because our marriage lacks legitimacy, but because Reginald has never required actual truth to cause considerable damage. Suspicion alone can be a weapon in the right hands, particularly when wielded by someone with his resources and patience. He found Eleanor later that evening in the library, curled into the window seat with a book she had clearly stopped reading some time ago, judging by the unfocused way she stared out at the darkening gardens. She looked up as he entered, immediately sensing the tension in his posture. "What's happened?" she asked. Alexander crossed the room and settled beside her, taking a moment to gather his thoughts before answering honestly, as he had promised himself he always would with her. "Reginald has been investigating our marriage. Your background, specifically, and the timeline connecting your contract here to our wedding." Eleanor's stomach tightened with a familiar unwelcome anxiety. What does he hope to find? Enough doubt to challenge the marriage's legitimacy under the trust's terms, Alexander said. Not because there is any actual illegitimacy to find, but because doubt alone can be sufficient to force a costly, damaging legal battle. Can he actually win such a challenge? I don't believe so, Alexander said. Our marriage meets every legal requirement outlined in the trust. But winning is not necessarily his primary goal, Eleanor. Damage may be enough to satisfy him, particularly damage to your reputation and mine. Eleanor absorbed this information slowly, feeling the quiet happiness of recent weeks give way to a familiar, unwelcome dread. "This is my fault," she said quietly. "If I had a different background, fewer financial troubles for him to point toward as motive." "This is not your fault," Alexander said firmly, taking her hand in his. "This is Reginald's ambition, nothing more. He would find some angle to challenge our marriage, regardless of your background, simply because our marriage stands directly between him and everything he believes he deserves. What do we do?" "We continue exactly as we have been," Alexander said. "We do not hide. We do not act as though we have anything to be ashamed of, because we do not. Our marriage is genuine, Eleanor, in every sense that matters, legal and otherwise. Reginald can investigate all he wishes. He will find nothing but the truth, and the truth offers him no real weapon at all." Eleanor wanted to believe him completely, wanted to trust that the genuine love they had built together would prove sufficient protection against whatever Reginald intended to attempt. But some quiet, cautious part of her recognized that determined men rarely abandoned their ambitions simply because the truth stood against them. Sometimes, she knew from painful experience, the truth mattered considerably less than the story a determined person chose to tell instead. She did not yet know that within weeks, Reginald's investigation would lead him directly toward the small town she had once called home, toward an engagement party where an old, cruel ghost from her past would unknowingly hand him exactly the kind of public spectacle he needed to accelerate his plans far sooner than either she or Alexander anticipated. The photograph landed in Reginald's inbox at 11 that same night, sent by a man he had quietly paid weeks earlier to keep watch over anyone connected to Eleanor's past, in case her old life ever intersected usefully with his plans. He opened the image at his desk, coffee growing cold beside him, and felt a slow, satisfied grin spread across his face as he took in the scene captured within it. Alexander, standing in a modest rented hall decorated with paper lanterns, his arm resting protectively around Eleanor's waist, surrounded by a crowd of clearly startled small-town guests. The accompanying message read simply, "They confirmed the marriage publicly tonight. Guest named Julian Marsh appears to be an ex-fiancé of Mrs. Hales. Details attached." Reginald read through the attached notes twice, his mind already working through how best to use this information. A duke, appearing unannounced at a modest engagement party in his wife's small hometown, confirming their marriage publicly for the first time, in response to an old rival's mockery. It was, he realized, a far more useful story than he had originally anticipated, one that painted the marriage not as a carefully calculated legal arrangement, but as something almost theatrical, something staged for effect rather than born of genuine private commitment. He drafted an email to his lawyer immediately, attaching the photograph and outlining a new angle for their legal challenge. If the marriage had been kept secret for months, only to be revealed publicly and dramatically at precisely the moment Eleanor faced social humiliation from a former partner, it suggested a relationship built more around strategic timing and public perception than genuine, long-standing affection. It was not proof of illegitimacy, not yet, but it was exactly the kind of narrative a determined lawyer could shape into considerable doubt. Meanwhile, the drive back to Ashworth Manor passed mostly in comfortable silence, Eleanor resting her head against the car window, watching the dark countryside blur past, while Alexander drove with the same calm focus he brought to everything. "Thank you," she said eventually, breaking the quiet, "for coming tonight. I know it wasn't simple, revealing everything so suddenly. I would do considerably more than drive an hour on short notice for you, Eleanor," Alexander said. "Watching that man speak to you the way he did, even secondhand through your voice on the phone, was not something I was willing to tolerate a moment longer than necessary." Grace was thrilled, at least, Eleanor said, allowing herself a small smile. "I think she's already planning to tell the entire town before we've even properly announced anything." "Let her," Alexander said. "I have no interest in continuing to hide something I am, in fact, considerably proud of." Eleanor turned to study his profile in the dim light of the dashboard, feeling a warmth spread through her chest at the simple, sincere affection in his words. "I'm proud of it too," she said softly. "I just wish the timing felt less complicated, given everything happening with Reginald." "The timing was never going to be simple," Alexander admitted. "Reginald would have found some angle to challenge our marriage, regardless of when or how it became public. Perhaps it is better this way, revealed on our own terms, in defense of you, rather than uncovered later through his investigation, and twisted into whatever narrative served his purposes best." Eleanor wanted to believe that, wanted to trust that revealing the truth openly had somehow strengthened their position, rather than handed Reginald new material to exploit. But some quiet unease lingered in her chest all the same, a feeling she could not quite shake despite Alexander's calm reassurance. That unease proved entirely justified 3 days later, when Alexander received a formal letter from Reginald's lawyer, requesting a meeting to discuss what the letter carefully termed questions regarding the timeline and circumstances of the current Duchess's marriage, relevant to the family trust's succession requirements. "He's moving faster than I expected," Alexander said grimly, reading the letter a second time at the breakfast table, while Eleanor watched his expression darken with each line. "This suggests he has information he believes strengthens his position considerably." "What kind of information could he possibly have found?" Eleanor asked. "Our marriage is legitimate, Alexander. Legally documented, properly witnessed. Legitimacy under law is not necessarily his target," Alexander said, setting the letter down. "He is building a narrative, Eleanor, one designed to suggest our marriage was calculated and strategic rather than genuine, timed conveniently to satisfy the trust's deadline, and then revealed publicly only when it served a useful purpose. The party, unfortunately, may have handed him exactly the kind of theatrical narrative he needed." Eleanor felt her stomach drop at the implication. "You think he knows about the party, about what happened with Julian?" "I suspect he knows a great deal more than we would prefer," Alexander said. "Reginald has never been a man who leaves details to chance, particularly not when considerable inheritance hangs in the balance." The meeting was scheduled for the following week, and in the days leading up to it, Eleanor found herself increasingly anxious, replaying every moment of the party in her mind, wondering what innocent detail might have been twisted into something far more damaging in Reginald's carefully constructed narrative. She had faced Julian's cruelty that night with genuine strength, had finally claimed her marriage publicly, with real pride rather than fear. It seemed deeply unfair that the very moment of her triumph might now become the foundation of an attack against everything she and Alexander had built together. "We will face this together," Alexander promised her, the night before the meeting, holding her close in the quiet darkness of their bedroom. "Whatever Reginald believes he has discovered, whatever narrative he intends to present, it cannot change the truth of what exists between us, Eleanor. That truth is stronger than anything he can construct against it." Eleanor wanted desperately to believe him, wanted to trust that love alone would prove sufficient defense against a man as calculating and determined as Reginald Hale. But as she lay awake, long after Alexander's breathing had settled into the steady rhythm of sleep, she could not shake the growing certainty that whatever awaited them in that meeting would test their marriage and their resolve more severely than anything they had yet faced together. "Your marriage," the lawyer said, sliding a folder across the polished conference table, "appears to have been arranged with considerable convenience relative to the trust's deadline, and then concealed from public knowledge for several months, only to be revealed, rather theatrically, at an event entirely unrelated to your family's affairs." Alexander did not touch the folder. He kept his eyes fixed on Reginald instead, who sat across the table with the barely contained satisfaction of a man who believed victory was already within reach. "I fail to see how the manner of a marriage's revelation affects its legal legitimacy," Alexander said evenly. "The trust requires a legitimate, legally binding union. It does not specify the timing or method of any public announcement." "No," the lawyer agreed, "it does not, explicitly. However, the trust's original language, if you examine the historical intent behind it, clearly presumes a marriage entered into with genuine long-term commitment, rather than one structured primarily to satisfy an imminent deadline. We intend to argue that the circumstantial evidence, the timing, the secrecy, the theatrical public reveal, suggests a marriage of convenience, rather than the kind of genuine union the trust's original authors intended to require."
"So well!" Eleanor sat beside Alexander, her hands folded tightly in her lap, forcing herself to remain outwardly composed despite the anxiety twisting through her stomach.
She had known this meeting would be difficult, but hearing her marriage, her genuine feelings for Alexander, reduced to calculated legal strategy in a cold conference room, felt considerably more painful than she had anticipated. "May I speak?" she said, surprising herself as much as anyone else in the room. Alexander glanced at her, something protective flickering across his features, though he nodded, trusting her judgment. "Please," Reginald said, an unmistakable note of condescension in his voice, as though humoring a child who had wandered into an adult conversation. "You seem to believe," Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor she felt beneath the surface, "that genuine love cannot exist alongside practical circumstances. That because our marriage began partly as a solution to a difficult deadline, it cannot also have become something real and lasting. I would ask you to consider, Reginald, whether your own certainty on this matter comes from genuine legal reasoning, or simply from your own inability to imagine that anyone might choose partnership, and eventually love, for reasons beyond simple strategic advantage." Reginald's expression flickered, something briefly uncertain passing behind his eyes, before his composure returned. "Sentiment is not evidence, Mrs. Hale." "No," Eleanor agreed, "but neither is suspicion, particularly suspicion, built entirely on circumstantial timing, rather than any actual proof of wrongdoing. You have found nothing illegal in our marriage, Reginald, because there is nothing illegal to find. What you have found instead is a story you have chosen to tell, one that serves your ambitions considerably better than the actual truth does." "And what is the actual truth, in your account?" Reginald asked, his tone sharp now, stripped of its earlier condescension. "The truth," Eleanor said, "is that I met your cousin while restoring a wing of this estate that had been neglected for years. The truth is that I watched a man everyone described as cold and distant slowly reveal himself to be someone thoughtful, genuinely devoted to the people and legacy in his care. Someone who listened to me more carefully than anyone in my life ever had before. The truth is that our marriage began as a practical solution, yes, but it became something far more meaningful, long before that party you seem so fixated on, and no amount of clever narrative construction changes that fact." The room fell silent for a long moment, Reginald's lawyer glancing between his client and Eleanor, with a slightly uncertain expression, as though reconsidering the strength of the case he had been prepared to argue so confidently, only minutes earlier. Alexander reached over and took Eleanor's hand beneath the table, a small, private gesture that steadied her more than she expected. My cousin, he said, addressing Reginald directly now, has spent years believing that ambition alone entitles him to this family's legacy. He has never once considered that genuine devotion, genuine partnership, might prove a stronger foundation than any strategic calculation he could construct against it. I understand your desperation, Reginald. I understand what losing this challenge means for your own ambitions. But I will not allow you to reduce my marriage and my wife's genuine character to a mere legal strategy, simply to serve your purposes. Reginald's jaw tightened, and for a moment, something like genuine anger flashed across his composed features. This is not finished, Alexander. I have resources you have not yet accounted for. Connections within the board who share my concerns about your judgment and priorities. Then use them, Alexander said calmly. Challenge us formally, through whatever legal or procedural means you believe available to you. But I would advise you to consider carefully, Reginald, whether you are prepared for the outcome should this challenge fail entirely, as I believe it will. The board may begin to question your own judgment considerably more harshly, watching you expend such significant resources pursuing a challenge built on nothing more substantial than convenient timing and personal ambition. The meeting ended shortly afterward, with no formal resolution reached, though something in the room's dynamic had shifted considerably by the time Reginald and his lawyer gathered their materials and departed. Eleanor felt the tension slowly drain from her shoulders as the heavy conference room door closed behind them, though she knew, with weary certainty, that this confrontation had settled nothing permanently. You were remarkable in there, Alexander said quietly once they were alone, turning to face her with open admiration in his expression. I meant every word, Eleanor said. I'm tired of people assuming our marriage is somehow less real, simply because it began differently than they expected. It is entirely real, Alexander said, pulling her gently into his arms. More real, I think, than anything Reginald could ever hope to understand or construct against us. But even as she allowed herself to relax into the comfort of his embrace, Eleanor could not shake Reginald's parting words, the quiet thread of resources and board connections she did not yet fully understand. Whatever satisfaction they had gained from today's confrontation, she suspected, would prove only temporary. A single battle within a war, Reginald had no intention of abandoning, simply because his first attempt had failed to land as effectively as he had hoped. The emergency board meeting had been called with less than 24 hours' notice, and Eleanor knew, the moment Alexander read the summons aloud over breakfast, that Reginald had finally played whatever card he had been holding in reserve. He's claiming to have documentation, Alexander said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, proving that our marriage contract includes an undisclosed financial arrangement between us, structured specifically to circumvent the trust's requirements rather than reflect any genuine partnership. That's not true, Eleanor said immediately. There was no financial arrangement beyond what we discussed openly from the beginning. I know that, Alexander said, which means whatever documentation he claims to possess has either been fabricated entirely or badly misrepresented. Either way, we need to be prepared to demonstrate its falseness, convincingly, in front of the full board, this afternoon. They arrived at the estate's formal boardroom to find nearly a dozen board members already assembled, along with Reginald, seated at the head of the table with a confidence that made Eleanor's stomach tighten with dread. He nodded toward them as they entered, gesturing toward a folder placed prominently in the center of the table. Thank you all for accommodating such short notice, Reginald began, once everyone had settled into their seats. I understand the seriousness of what I am about to present, and I would not have called this meeting without absolute confidence in the material I intend to share. He opened the folder and distributed copies around the table, and Eleanor felt her breath catch as she scanned the document placed in front of her. A supposed financial agreement bearing both her signature and Alexander's, outlining a substantial payment to be transferred to her personal accounts upon completion of the marriage, timed precisely around the trust's deadline. This is fabricated, Eleanor said immediately, looking up to meet Reginald's gaze directly. I have never seen this document before in my life. That is not my signature. Forensic analysis suggests otherwise, Reginald said smoothly, though something flickered uncertainly behind his composed expression at the immediate firmness of her denial. Then I would welcome an independent forensic analysis, Alexander said, his voice cutting through the murmur that had begun rippling around the table. Conducted by an examiner of the board's choosing, not one selected by my cousin, given his obvious and considerable interest in this document proving genuine. Reginald's confidence flickered visibly now, though he recovered quickly. I am simply presenting evidence relevant to the board's decision, Alexander. I have no control over how convincingly that evidence speaks for itself. Then let it speak, Alexander said, through proper independent examination, rather than through your presentation of it here today. The board chairman, an elderly man named Charles Bentley, who had served the family for decades, cleared his throat and spoke for the first time since the meeting began. I believe that is a reasonable request, given the seriousness of the accusation. I propose we adjourn this specific matter until an independent forensic examiner can properly review the document's authenticity, along with the full financial history of both parties involved. Reginald's jaw tightened, but he had little grounds to object without appearing to fear exactly the kind of scrutiny he claimed to welcome. The meeting adjourned shortly afterward, though the tension in the room remained thick as board members filed out, whispering quietly among themselves about the unusual and dramatic accusation they had just witnessed. The forensic examination took place 3 days later, conducted by an independent specialist with no connection to either side of the family dispute. Eleanor and Alexander waited together in his study for the results, neither able to focus on anything else while they anticipated the outcome that would either vindicate them completely or, impossibly, somehow validate Reginald's fabricated claim. The call came late in the afternoon, and Eleanor watched Alexander's expression carefully as he listened, searching for any hint of the news before he spoke it aloud. "The signatures are confirmed forgeries," Alexander said finally, setting down the phone with visible relief flooding through his features. "Skillfully done, but forgeries nonetheless, according to the examiner's detailed analysis. The document was fabricated entirely." Eleanor felt tears of relief prick at her eyes, the tension of the past several days finally beginning to release from her shoulders. "Thank goodness," she said quietly. "I was so afraid, even knowing the truth, that somehow the board would believe him regardless." "They will not," Alexander said, crossing the room to pull her into his arms. "Reginald has just handed the board irrefutable proof of his own willingness to fabricate evidence against family members, purely to serve his personal ambitions. Whatever standing he retained on the board before today, I suspect it has been considerably diminished by this revelation." Eleanor rested her head against his chest, allowing herself finally to relax into the safety of his embrace. "I was so scared, Alexander, not just of losing the estate, but of watching everything we've built together be twisted into something ugly and calculated in front of people who don't know us at all." "I know," Alexander said softly, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "But listen to me carefully, Eleanor, because I need you to understand this fully. Whatever Reginald attempted, whatever fabricated evidence he presented, none of it could ever change what genuinely exists between us. I did not fall in love with you because of any deadline or trust requirement. I fell in love with you because you challenged me from the very first moment we met, because you brought life back into rooms I had long since given up on, because you see me clearly, in a way almost no one else in my life ever has. That truth has never once depended on any document, forged or otherwise." Eleanor pulled back slightly to meet his eyes, feeling the full weight and sincerity of his words settle over her like warmth after a long, difficult winter. "I fell in love with you long before I was willing to admit it, even to myself," she confessed. "I told myself it was foolish, that a practical arrangement couldn't possibly become something real. But you proved me wrong, Alexander, every single day since." He kissed her then, slow and certain, and Eleanor felt every lingering fear from the past weeks finally begin to dissolve, replaced by a quiet, unshakable confidence in the genuine foundation of everything they had built together. Reginald's schemes had failed, his fabricated evidence exposed for exactly what it was, and whatever consequences awaited him now, Eleanor felt certain that she and Alexander would face whatever remained of this challenge exactly as they had faced everything else, together, and stronger for having weathered it side by side. The board's final ruling arrived exactly 1 week later, and Charles Bentley read it aloud to a room considerably smaller than the one that had witnessed Reginald's failed accusation, since Reginald himself had chosen, wisely, not to attend. Given the confirmed fabrication of evidence presented against the Duke and current Duchess of Ashworth, Charles read, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet room. This board formally recognizes the marriage between Alexander Hale and Eleanor Whitmore Hale as entirely legitimate under the terms of the family trust, with full succession rights and estate management authority remaining, unquestionably, with the current Duke. Furthermore, given the severity of the attempted fabrication, this board recommends the immediate removal of Reginald Hale from any future consideration within estate governance or family trust matters. Alexander squeezed Eleanor's hand beneath the table as the ruling concluded, and she felt the last remaining tension of the past difficult weeks, finally, fully release from her chest. Reginald's ambition had cost him considerably more than his failed challenge, stripping him of whatever standing and future opportunity he might have retained within the family's affairs had he simply accepted the outcome gracefully instead. "It's over," Eleanor said quietly, once the meeting concluded and they found themselves alone in the hallway outside the boardroom. "It's over," Alexander confirmed, pulling her close. "And now, I believe, we have something considerably more pleasant to focus our attention toward." The ball took place 3 weeks later, held in the Grand Hall of Ashworth Manor, restored now to its full historic splendor, thanks to months of careful work Eleanor herself had overseen. Crystal chandeliers, cleaned and repaired, cast warm golden light across a room filled with guests from across the country, drawn by curiosity and genuine goodwill toward finally witnessing the public celebration of a marriage that had, until recently, remained largely private. Grace arrived early, practically bouncing with excitement as she took in the grandeur of the estate, pulling Eleanor aside the moment she spotted her. "You look absolutely radiant," she said, embracing her sister warmly. "I still can't quite believe all of this is real." "Neither can I, some days," Eleanor admitted, laughing softly. "But it is. All of it. Even Julian had been invited, at Eleanor's own insistence, though she suspected Alexander had agreed to the invitation more out of confidence in their relationship's strength than any genuine desire to extend particular warmth toward the man. Julian arrived looking considerably more subdued than he had at Grace's engagement party months earlier, approaching Eleanor cautiously once the initial reception had settled into easier conversation. "Thank you for inviting me," he said, genuine humility evident in his voice now. "I wasn't certain I deserved it, given how I behaved that night." "You didn't, particularly," Eleanor said honestly, though without any lingering bitterness in her tone. "But I've found, these past months, that holding on to old resentment serves very little purpose. I'm happy, Julian. Genuinely, completely happy. I'd rather extend grace toward that happiness than continue carrying old wounds forward." Julian nodded slowly, something like genuine respect settling into his expression. "He's a lucky man," he said, glancing toward where Alexander stood across the room, deep in conversation with several guests. "I hope you know that." "I do," Eleanor said simply, "though I think, honestly, we consider ourselves equally fortunate in each other." As the evening progressed, Alexander found her near the edge of the dance floor, extending his hand with the same quiet confidence that had first drawn her to him months earlier. "May I have this dance, Duchess?" Eleanor smiled, taking his hand and allowing him to lead her into the center of the floor as the orchestra began a slow, elegant waltz. "I could get used to that title," she said, laughing softly as he pulled her close. "I intend for you to have considerable practice with it," Alexander said, "for the remainder of both our lives." They moved together through the crowded room, surrounded by guests who had once known only rumors and speculation about their marriage, now witnessing instead the genuine, unmistakable affection between them. Eleanor caught sight of Grace watching from the sidelines, tears of happiness glistening in her eyes, and felt her own heart swell with gratitude for how far she had come. She thought back to that small rented hall months earlier, to Julian's cruel mockery, and the humiliation she had forced herself to endure with as much composure as she could muster. She had been, in that moment, a woman quietly hiding an extraordinary truth, uncertain how or when that truth would finally emerge into the light. Now, standing in the restored grandeur of Ashworth Manor, dancing beneath chandeliers she had helped bring back to life, surrounded by genuine friends and family who celebrated rather than questioned her happiness, Eleanor understood fully just how far she had traveled from that uncertain, humiliated version of herself. "What are you thinking about?" Alexander asked softly, noticing the distant look in her eyes. How grateful I am, Eleanor said, meeting his gaze fully. That being mocked for having no husband led me, eventually, to finding exactly the right one. Alexander smiled, the warm, genuine smile she had come to treasure more than any grand title or inherited fortune could ever compare to. I believe, he said quietly, that we found each other precisely when we were both finally ready. Everything before simply prepared us for this moment. As the music continued to swell around them, and the grand hall glowed with warmth and celebration long into the night, Eleanor allowed herself, fully and completely, to embrace the life she had built, not through any calculated arrangement or convenient timing, but through genuine love that had grown steadily stronger with every challenge it faced. She was no longer the woman mocked for standing alone. She was the Duchess of Ashworth, chosen not for convenience or obligation, but for love, real and enduring, exactly as it was always meant to be.